Latta, South Carolina. One officer for 1,300 people. On January 17, 2026, the Latta Police Department in South Carolina was reduced to a single full-time officer. One officer for 1,300 residents across 1.1 square miles. 4 officers had resigned within 72 hours, leaving the community dependent on the Dillon County Sheriff's Office for basic law enforcement coverage. When residents call 911, deputies now respond from outside town limits. The officers who knew local neighborhoods, who walked the streets daily, who built relationships with business owners, are gone. This marks the 6th time in 12 years that Latta has lost its police chief. In August of 2025, Allan Rogers became Latta's permanent police chief after 1 month as interim chief. Rogers brought 37 years of law enforcement experience from the Latta Police Department, the Mullins Police Department, the Marion County Sheriff's Office, and the Dillon County Sheriff's Office. Under Rogers and Captain Simon Temple, the department was rebuilding. They rewrote internal policies that had never been properly established. They inventoried neglected equipment. They updated computer systems that had not been touched in years. Rogers or Temple walked through town on foot every day, talking to residents and business owners. In a November 2025 interview, Rogers said his priority was bringing the community together. Temple discussed creating accountability standards the department had never had. They were processing hundreds of pieces of evidence from previous administrations, planning a drone program, and training new officers. On January 15, 2026, it ended. Chief Rogers, Captain Temple, Officer Jalen McKenzie, and Officer Cody Flanagan submitted resignations. The stated reason was excessive control over department operations that made ethical, community-focused policing impossible. Rogers specifically mentioned pressure to shift toward a numbers-driven approach focused on traffic tickets instead of community relationships. The town council held a special meeting within 48 hours. After a 90-minute executive session, they voted to accept the resignations effective immediately. Temple had listed January 16th as his last day. Rogers and McKenzie had given 2-week notices dated for January 29th, but the council terminated them early. By January 17th, 1 full-time officer remained. The Dillon County Sheriff's Office stepped in to provide coverage, as they had done in July of 2022 during the previous wave of resignations. When a police department is staffed by officers who live in the community and respond from inside town limits, response time is measured in minutes. When coverage shifts to a county sheriff's office covering multiple municipalities, response time expands. Sheriff Jamie Hamilton has repeatedly stepped up to help Latta, but county deputies are already responsible for unincorporated areas and other towns. Adding Latta stretches resources thinner. Community policing requires continuity. Officers who see the same people daily, who understand local dynamics, who build relationships over time. When an entire department leadership structure collapses, those programs stop. The policies being written go unfinished. The training gets interrupted. The equipment inventory sits incomplete. The pattern extends back more than a decade. In April of 2014, Mayor Earl Bullard fired Police Chief Crystal Moore after 23 years of service. Moore had worked her way up from dispatcher to the town's first female police chief with a spotless record. In a single day, she received 7 reprimands and was terminated. Residents held vigils. More than 500 people signed petitions demanding her reinstatement. At an emergency council meeting, nearly 200 residents appeared, some carrying protest signs. In June of 2014, the town voted in a referendum to restructure its government from a strong mayor system to a strong council system, specifically to give the council power to rehire Moore. The vote was 328 to 147. The council reinstated her unanimously. Moore was fired again in September of 2016. The town cited performance issues. Moore claimed it was retaliation for reporting a sexual harassment complaint. She filed a federal lawsuit in July of 2021. The lawsuit was dismissed without prejudice in 2022. After Moore left, Derek Cartwright served as chief from 2016 to 2020. He eventually left for a position with the Dillon County Sheriff's Office. In July of 2022, Police Chief Josh Holt resigned after 6 months. Within days, 5 more officers followed. At the same time, 2 town council members resigned. The town attorney resigned. The town was left without a mayor due to an ongoing election dispute, without a full council, without a police chief, and without adequate officers. The Dillon County Sheriff's Office stepped in while the town rebuilt. Lieutenant Zane Bryant was named interim chief on August 1st, 2022. By October 2022, he was made permanent. Bryant's tenure ended in controversy. In May of 2025, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Training Council found that the Latta Police Department was not in compliance with state law. South Carolina requires uncertified officers to work only when accompanied by a certified officer. The department had been allowing uncertified officers to work alone. The fine was $39,900. On June 25, 2025, the State Law Enforcement Training Council met to consider withdrawing Bryant's law enforcement certification. Evidence showed that Bryant had submitted untruthful paperwork to the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy multiple times. Documents proved he knew uncertified officers were not supposed to work alone, but he allowed it anyway. Bryant resigned on July 2, 2025. Allan Rogers was appointed interim chief on July 3, 2025. He was made permanent in August 2025. By January 2026, he was gone. 6 police chiefs in 12 years, not counting interim periods. Every time a chief leaves, institutional knowledge walks out. Policies get rewritten from scratch. Training starts over. Community relationships have to be rebuilt. New officers have to learn the town from the beginning. In November of 2025, 2 months before the latest resignations, Captain Temple wrote a year in review for the department. He outlined goals for 2026, being fully staffed, processing the hundreds of pieces of evidence that had piled up, bringing the Emergency Operations Center back online after years of neglect, and updating officer equipment. 6 weeks later, he resigned. When a police department collapses this frequently, the effects compound. Recruiting becomes difficult. Officers leave before they can pass on skills to newer recruits. Policies get half-written and abandoned. Programs dissolve when leadership turns over. Community trust erodes. Residents build relationships with officers who then leave. They watch new leadership promise change, and then watch that leadership walk away. The financial cost accumulates. Recruitment costs, training costs, equipment purchased and then unused. Fines like $39,900 levied in 2025. The cost of relying on county coverage. For a town with a median household income of $45,500 and where 27% of residents live below the poverty line, this represents money that could go toward infrastructure, services, or stable taxes. Latta currently has 1 full-time officer for 1,300 residents. The Dillon County Sheriff's Office is providing coverage as an emergency measure, not a long-term solution. Eventually, Latta needs its own functioning police department. That means recruiting a new chief, hiring officers willing to join a department with this history, and rebuilding trust with a community that has watched this cycle repeat 6 times. The consequences extend beyond response times. When officers do not stay long enough to know a community, they cannot do proactive policing. They cannot identify patterns, build relationships with at-risk youth, or partner with schools, businesses, and community organizations. When a department is in constant crisis mode, it becomes reactive. Officers respond to calls, write reports, and move on. There is no capacity for community programs, no bandwidth for prevention. When a town's police department becomes known for instability, it affects economic development. Businesses want reliable basic services. Families want assurance their town can maintain essential services. Chronic dysfunction in law enforcement signals that a town cannot manage its own affairs. Latta's population has declined by more than 4% since 2020. The median household income is $45,500, well below the state median of $66,818. 13.5% of families live in poverty. Repeated police department collapses work against the stability needed to attract investment and retain residents. Small-town policing is personal. In a town of 1,300 people, residents know who the chief is. They see officers at the grocery store, at church, at community events. When Rogers and Temple walked through town every day, they were visible, accessible, part of daily life. When those relationships get severed every year or two, residents lose officers they trusted. Officers who knew their kids, who understood their neighborhood, who could tell the difference between a serious problem and a minor issue because they had context. Starting over with new officers from outside the community means losing that context. Every interaction starts from zero. Knowing whether a situation is unusual or routine, whether someone is a chronic problem or having a one-time bad day, whether a call is likely to escalate, all of that depends on knowledge that takes time to build. Latta keeps losing that knowledge before it can take root. The 1,300 people who live in Latta are currently dependent on the Dillon County Sheriff's Office for an indefinite period. They have no timeline for when their town will have a functioning police department again. They have no assurance that even if a new chief is hired, that chief will stay long enough to make a difference. A town of 1,300 people is attempting to function without adequate law enforcement. A community has watched 6 police chiefs come and go in 12 years. The pattern shows no sign of breaking.